Welcome. My name is Trelor Bauer. I'm a curator at the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery, and I thank you all for joining us at the Lindenmeier Ancient Lives, Ancient Dreams Symposium. About a year ago, a volunteer with the Natural Areas Department in the city proposed an idea with some unique ideas for interpreting the Lindenmeier site, which is now owned by the city of Fort Collins and is part of their natural area known as Soapstone Prairie. Natural Area staff brought the idea to the museum, and through a series of conversations, we came up with the idea of having a symposium. Brian Carroll is that volunteer from Natural Areas who first percolated these ideas. He and other volunteers with Natural Areas had attended professional conferences, archaeology conferences, and we thought, why not bring this content to the community of Fort Collins? This is a community that is highly interested in Lindenmeier. Many people in the region grew up hearing about this site and about the excavations that happened in the 1930s. Some people here have relatives that served on those crews. Others knew local boy Jim Greenacre, who grew up to be an archaeologist, and his wife Doris, who was also born in Fort Collins. Others know the Powers family. Their son, Forrest Wayne Powers, served on the crew. Still others were students of Bob Easterday, a crew member who went on to become a teacher. Lindenmeier has its own mythology here in northern Colorado. And between its great antiquity and its spectacular beauty and the accessibility of the story to our community, we all feel connection to it. For some of us, there's only 1 degree of separation, if you will, to Lindenmeier. So the idea of having a symposium seems a win-win. The professional archaeologist can reach out to the community to share their ideas with a general audience, which generates understanding of their work and support for it, while the community gains insight to the new research questions, the methodologies that are being developed, groundbreaking technologies that are being used, and the latest theories. Of course, none of this would not have happened, if it weren't for 4 groups of people. Now, the first is our planning committee. Staff members from the Natural Areas Department working on this project include Zoe Shark. There in the back, she's waving. Zoe is my no-nonsense, straight shooter, highly efficient and organized partner in crime. I could not have gotten through the last year without her. Jessica Miller and Deborah Price, educators with that department. We also had our volunteer group, Brian Carroll, as I mentioned, Michael Stone, and Gary Rom. They're not going to wave. You guys are being shy, huh? Yeah, there they are. There were a few times when we were faced with some obstacles that I thought we really can't pull this off, but Mark Sears, the manager of the Natural Areas Department, made it happen. He really stepped up, and I owe him a personal thank you for doing that. The staff and the leadership teams at both Natural Areas and the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery were mentors and cheerleaders to us, and we thank them. And of course, the families of our volunteers. We stole a lot of hours out of their lives, so thank you. I see Vicki out there, is Sharon here. The second group of people I'd like to thank are the speakers. They all graciously accepted our invitations to come and speak, and some of them had very long journeys to get here by car and by plane. Dr. Edwin Wilmson came from Scotland to be here with us. Thank goodness he came last Thursday, so he has had time to get over his jet lag. Dr. Stanford and Dr. Jodry left Washington, D.C. At the crack of dawn Eastern time to get here today. And that's after Dr. Stanford had a late night fundraiser himself at the Smithsonian's Castle last night. So thank you. Dr. Saleh flew in this morning from Lawrence, Kansas. Not quite as far a journey, but having done it myself, it's not short either. We have Bridget Ambler driving in from Dolores, Colorado to be here with us tomorrow. She's a curator with the Anasazi Heritage Center. We also have Drs. Frizen and Wagaspak joining us from Laramie. Cody Newton, a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, will be here tomorrow. And lastly, but not last, we have Dr. Jason LaBelle, our own archaeologist over at Colorado State University, who is here today to speak and will also be joining some of the panels through the symposium. He was indispensable to us as he offered advice and guidance as we developed this symposium. So thank you, Dr. LaBelle. Within this group, I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. William Scoggin. He is the nephew of original crew member Charles Chili Scoggin. He came down to be with us for this symposium, and while he's not giving a formal presentation, he has wonderful stories to tell about the social history of the site, so do seek him out during the events over the next few days. Next, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors for the event. Their generous funds made this possible and also allowed us to grant ticket waivers to people on fixed or limited incomes, such as students. We're able to get 17 students in to this event. I can't imagine as a student how amazing this opportunity would be. So thank you to the Sutherland family, Tom and Jean, the Rotary Club of Fort Collins 1918 Club, the Northern Colorado chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society, the City of Fort Collins Fort Fund, and Sather's Leading Jewelers. As I said, significantly, their support allowed this event to happen, and I can only imagine what future generations of archaeologists watching this event on DVD, because we're able to record it, will think of our understandings as we express them here this week. Additionally, Pateros Creek has made a Lindenmeier brew for us, which you will be able to sample this evening over at the brewery between 5 and 7. And Fiona's Delicatessen is providing the dessert at the dessert reception this evening, which was supported by the Wilkins Charitable Trust. The last group I want to thank, of course, are you, the participants. This event is for you and about you, so thank you for coming out. If you'll indulge me for just a moment in a story, I was a 20-year-old undergraduate anthropology major at Colorado College the first time I heard about Lindenmeier. It was in my Prehistory of Colorado textbook during my archaeological field school, and I can remember sitting at the campfire. We would read by the light of the fire, our textbook. Lindenmeier was mentioned one time on page 12, and that was it. And I think, how could that be? Lindenmeier is the site of the smoking gun. It's the bison vertebra with the broken projectile point embedded into it, which proved without question that there was no accidental association between human artifacts and the ancient extinct bison antiquus. This was the site that humanized these ancient people who were depicted in popular art during the 20s and 30s as brutish cavemen. The people who were here this morning know how I feel about that. They didn't live in caves and they weren't just men. Lindenmeier is the site where delicate bone needles were discovered and the tools of women, scrapers, were found. It's a home site. We found beautiful hematite bead, etched lines on it, a lignite bead, a piece of bone disc with etched lines on it as well. And these give us insight to a complex society with families, a society that could sew and protect itself from the Ice Age climate and had the free time to make non-utilitarian items. They weren't worried about where their next meal was coming from, unlike those popular illustrations of the half-naked man hunting a mammoth. Not accurate at all. And yet it's not explored in my textbook, and I don't know how that could be. In 1998, after I had interned at the National Museum of Natural History and worked at a few museums, I got a job as a curator at the then Fort Collins Museum. I was very excited when, only 8 weeks into my position there, my boss came to me and said, "You have the opportunity to escort Dr. Stanford and Dr. Jodrey to Lindenmeier." Let me be clear, they escorted me, and I absorbed everything they said. It was then, on that trip, getting to go up to the site, that I got it. What that textbook failed to do, a single visit to the site, one day up there, conveyed to me how important this site is. And in the years since, in my role at the museum, I have attempted to share the import of that site with thousands of museum visitors through our exhibits, our programs, and most especially through an annual parade of second graders coming to the museum for their local history courses. Now, the Lindenmeier site is owned and managed by the City of Fort Collins Natural Areas Department, and hundreds of people a year can visit Soapstone Prairie Natural Area, and they are able to walk a quarter-mile paved trail to a shelter that overlooks the Lindenmeier Arroyo. You can see straight into that stratigraphy with that dark layer of soil, the living layer of the Folsom people, that paleosol. It's clearly visible. I have a dear colleague over at the Poudre School District who has worked with me since about 2001, creating videos for grade 2, studying their local history. His first trip to the site was just this past summer. He said, "For all the years I have heard you speak about this site, it wasn't until I went up there that I, quote unquote, got it." What an amazing thing that Natural Areas has done, allowing people to get up close to that site so that they can get it too. I suspect that most of you are here today because you get it. You get it about this site and how beautiful it is, spectacular it is, how important it is, and how it links us to these people from over 10,000 years ago. I hope that on Wednesday, if you don't get it, that as you leave the site with your head full of the information the archaeologists and curators share with you over the next few days, and you've had a chance to go up to the site, that you will get it too. Now, as we dive into the sessions, we are starting today with a pretty pointed look at Lindenmeier. Dalen Figgs, who's a senior environmental planner with the City of Fort Collins, will talk about the management of the site today. And Dr. LaBelle will talk about the history of the site and look at it in context of this region of Colorado and explore just why this site is so unique. As we go through other days, we're going to take lenses out a further bit. We're going to look at other sites of Folsom-era Paleo-Indians in Colorado with Dr. Wagaspak talking about Barger Gulch and Dr. Dodry talking about Stewart's Cattle Guard. Then we're going to take an even further step back, and we're going to talk bigger picture about the occupation of people in North America. We're going to talk about shamanism, and I hope lead you into consideration of the importance of the Native voice and understanding their history on this continent. So don't be surprised if in a few years the museum comes back and hosts a symposium with Native elders talking about how there are other ways of knowing to help us give insight to these locations, and particularly Lindenmeier. The fact is, even though it's been 11,500 years ago since the people lived at Lindenmeier, we do have something in common with them. We both live on this beautiful landscape. It doesn't matter what you call it, or what political system it's under, or religion you practice. We have those connections. It's amazing to be able to do that. They really are the first people in our local history. So, thank you for indulging me in my opening remarks today. I am going to pass the mic over to Dalen Figgs. As I said, he's the Senior Environmental Planner for the City of Fort Collins, managing Soapstone Prairie. Dalen?
Well, good afternoon. First, I guess I want to thank everyone for making the trip to Fort Collins, and those for you who traveled from out of town. Welcome. It's a great community, and enjoy your stay. My name's Dalen Figgs, and I'm with the Natural Areas Department. And I was fortunate enough to start my tenure with Natural Areas about the time Soapstone was purchased by the Natural Areas. So I was able to lead the development of the management plan and go through the public process, but also fortunate enough to oversee the implementation of that plan. And I guess I want to talk a little bit about that today. So this afternoon, I really want to give you a pretty broad overview of how Soapstone is managed, and I'll focus a little bit on other aspects of the management plan besides cultural resources, but really focus in on the cultural resource side. And so I want to talk more specifically about how we manage the resource the way we do and some of the management practices that we use. And then finally, I want to open up the dialogue a little bit and talk about next steps. We've owned Soapstone for about 10 years now, bought it in 2004, and we've taken a protect-in-place philosophy in our management of cultural resources. And I guess now is a good time to really sort of broach the topic of, are we ready for the next step and what that next step is? Should we begin to explore some of the cultural sites a bit more? Not just the Lindenmeier site, but other cultural sites on Soapstone and other properties that we hold in our conserved land system. And I think this is a good time to start that dialogue. We have a lot of experts in the room. We have a lot of people who have a tremendous amount of interest in the cultural resource aspects of the properties we've conserved. And I guess I want to have that conversation a little bit toward the end of this discussion. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about Soapstone and put it in context of why we've conserved the property and what it means to the Natural Areas Department. Soapstone is part of a larger conservation effort that's been undertaken not just by the natural areas, but by several partners in conservation. And it really was this concerted effort to conserve a broad swath of land that stretches from the mountains to the west to the plains to the east. And this was driven by conservation values, natural resource values, and basically creating a wildlife corridor, a movement corridor for animals that make an elevational migration. We often think of migratory pathways north to south, but there's also an elevation gradient that animals move through as well. Winter in the plains and then move to the mountains in the summertime. This was one of the few places left in the Front Range where this movement could occur without running into a town or a city or something developed along the way. And so it's a pretty unique landscape. So this was a large property that was purchased by Natural Areas, and you can see Soapstone Prairie in the middle of that. We also own Meadow Springs, which is next door. So the two properties together total about 50,000 acres. This also represented not only the largest acquisition for Natural Areas at the time, but with our first real cultural site, quite frankly, of the magnitude of Lindenmeier. We never will buy another property with a National Historic Landmark, and it really brought to light the responsibility of managing cultural sites on natural area properties. I mean, we have several properties we own and manage to have cultural sites, but certainly nothing as well known as the Lindenmeier site. And so it also represents really the first time we fully integrated cultural resource management into the management plan and how we manage the property from day to day. And quite frankly, the cultural resources on the site really led to a lot of the decisions that we made, things like on-trail only, things of that nature, to avoid these sites as best we can as we bring recreation to this landscape. I think people have utilized this landscape for thousands of years, and we were one of the groups that brought a different use in terms of recreation and bringing the public to the landscape, and that was a unique challenge. So Soapstone was purchased in 2004, and we started the acquisition with about 12,000 acres. And since then have added properties along the way. We total now about 22,500 acres. And we developed a management plan in 2009, or at least we adopted the management plan in 2009. So we're often asked, well, what happened between 2004 and 2009? There was a 5-year gap there. And it really was a sort of a time for us to understand what the property had on it. So we conducted really an extensive amount of ecological and cultural surveys across the property, really understanding really two things. What were the resource values that occurred on the property, and probably as importantly, where those resources were found. We know they're not evenly distributed across landscapes. They tend to be clumped together, and we needed to understand that distribution. We also did a very extensive public outreach process. When we first purchased Soapstone, there were a lot of questions from the public as to why we'd buy a property that far north. It goes all the way up to the state line. It was a long way from town, and it was really kind of a unique purchase for Natural Areas. And so we really began to reach out to the public with a more focused approach of understanding why we purchased the property. And the interesting thing is a common theme that we would hear back from the public when they got a chance to visit the site was they were amazed by the natural resource values. You go up there and you see wildlife, you see birds, you see pronghorn, you see a lot of species that are pretty unique to the grasslands. But they always came back with this, the natural resources were amazing, but wow, what about those cultural resources? Those just blew them away. And they really began to let us know that they were important, and they were important to the public of Fort Collins, and they wanted to see us conserve those. And so it really drove, again, the management plan decisions that we made. We also created a technical advisory committee, and this is what really helped us sort of flesh out the management plan in a lot of ways. These were local experts in various fields, recreation, different species, different landscapes. We brought together to sort of help us bounce ideas around and inform the management plan of some of the practices that we could use to utilize this landscape for recreation and conservation while protecting these resources. And it really was a group of people that helped build the foundation of the management plan. And the whole management plan is built around the idea of conservation targets. We'll talk a little bit more about these here in a few minutes, but it's a big landscape, there's a lot of resources, and you can't manage everything all the time. And so it really helped us sort of focus our management approach to key aspects of the properties in terms of what were the highest resource values from a wildlife standpoint, what are the highest resource values from a landscape and broad habitat type standpoint. So it really helped us to identify those. Cultural resources are one of our conservation targets broadly applied to this landscape. And there was really then a consultation process, and not from a NEPA standpoint or anything like that, but really as we began to hone and apply management practices, the technical committee really gave us a sounding board to help sort of flesh out whether these were good ideas or bad ideas, and we could really fine-tune how we manage the property. So the conservation targets were picked, and I know this is sort of a busy slide, and I really throw it up there to really focus at two different things that are here in yellow. We have a lot of different conservation targets and a lot of nested targets to sort of help us refine management practices. But cultural resources are there really for two different reasons. One is, in and of itself, it's a conservation target. It's a very important resource that we want to conserve on the property. But we also recognize that cultural resources also fall into some of these other conservation targets because you can't separate certain features on a landscape like water from human use of the property. And so every time we find springs and seeps and wetlands, close by is a cultural site, and that's part of managing that natural system, is understanding the distribution of or the location of the cultural sites relative to those unique wildlife features. So as we began to build maps showing the distribution of the resources, it was very clear that there was a tremendous amount of overlap between the cultural resources and the biological resources, and I think that's really kind of the interesting story from an ecologist standpoint. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm an ecologist, and the interesting story is really just that human connection to the landscape and people living in places that are still unique areas today. They were living by water, they were finding food, they were foraging in these landscapes, and that's pretty special to kind of see that coming out in today's data as well. So cultural resource management, we'll begin to sort of hone in a little bit. Cultural resources are a conservation target. It's one of the things we talk about all the time as we apply management practices to this property. Of course, we have the Lindenmeier site, and it's one of the key factors in how we manage the property. We also have a lot of other locations on the property that were utilized by Native Americans. We have dozens, if not a few hundred, archaeological sites that Dr. LaBelle has discovered over the years. And understanding those and managing those, and not in dissimilar ways from the Lindenmeier site, is one of the management aspects that we have. We also had a lot of homesteading that occurred up here. We have several homestead-era buildings and homes that people utilized that are still on the property in some form or fashion. Some are in better shape than others, and all still part of that human connection to the landscape and a historical site or cultural site that we want to conserve. And then last, in more recent times, Soapstone has a long history of ranching. This is part of the F.E. Warren Livestock Company. It has a lot of the buildings that F.E. Warren built in the day. We still use them as our ranching operation. We use livestock grazing as one of our management tools. We work with local ranchers to do that. So a lot of the buildings that are on Soapstone that were built and used by F.E. Warren are still used by our grazing association, so we have a close connection to that part of our history as well. Well, this is straight out of the management plan, and some of the concerns we had with cultural resources back in 2004 were really about opening the property up to public use for the first time ever. This has been held in private ownership, and the grazing association that owns Soapstone that we purchased the property from were very good stewards of the property. Not just ecologically, they handed over a property that was in beautiful condition from a grassland standpoint, but they were highly protective of the Lindenmeier site, and I'm sure some in this room know that firsthand. They wouldn't let people go up there, and they were really concerned that people were finding their way onto the property. So they were pretty diligent about keeping an eye on the place. And so when we opened it up, we knew really two things. One is that, with being the first time it's open to the public, a lot of people want to see it. And that really led to some of the decisions about the overlook that was talked about earlier and where it's located and why it's located. And it's the only hard surface ADA trail within Soapstone Prairie. We have 40 miles of trail, a quarter mile is hard surface. And we did that intentionally to allow people access to the Lindenmeier site, at least visually. And then also, because of its ranching history and because it is a erosive landscape, we had other management practices we need to address. And we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail later, but really modifying some of the grazing practices that occurred to deal with erosion issues and things of that nature. And that's just not the Lindenmeier site. That's the other archaeological sites we have on the property. We want to, again, protect them in place, and we didn't want to expose artifacts, just from erosional aspects or speeded up erosional aspects. And then we also had site security concerns along the way, and put together a series of management practices to try and deal with that. It hasn't been a problem, knock on wood, but it is something we're very careful about and very watchful of as we go through time here. And then, the visitor aspect of getting to the Lindenmeier site, and we'll talk about that as well. So this is from 2004, and the one thing you don't see is sort of any investigation of the site. And we'll, again, sort of brings to that question, are we ready to take that next step? So one of the things that we have to do to manage our archaeological sites or our cultural sites on Soapstone is understand where they are. And Dr. LaBelle and others have spent a tremendous amount of time on Soapstone looking for the archaeological sites that occur. And I just got to say, Dr. LaBelle has been a tremendous asset to natural areas. And what success we've had at managing Soapstone for cultural resources, wouldn't be there without Dr. LaBelle's help. He's been a great advisor and a great partner in understanding our cultural resources. But this is a map that really looks at the archaeological sites that we know of. And this is, a couple of things. You can see they're scattered about the property, not just Lindenmeier, but you also see that they're clumped together quite nicely in a lot of areas. And from this, we can sort of build these broader maps of looking at cultural resources that we use when we talk to people about management practices. And a couple of things I guess I want to point out here is you can see that we have surveyed a fair amount of the property, but a tremendous amount of the property is left unsurveyed. And cultural resources aren't all equal, I guess, in that we have higher value resources in some parts of the property than others, and we've sort of separated those out again from a management practice standpoint. The other reason I threw this map up is because this wasn't developed just for understanding our cultural resources. This was developed because of outside pressures that come to the property from other interests, and in this case, oil and gas. And so as managers of the site, we have to sort of play both sides of the fence, I guess. We can be proactive and protective, but we also have to be reactive to impacts that come from outside sources, and that's always sort of a balancing act for us. The other question that came up is, because of all the areas that haven't been surveyed, what are the chances of finding cultural resources elsewhere on the property? So again, Dr. LaBelle helped us answer that question and put together a map showing potential sites for cultural resources, sort of based on what he understood from finding the ones that we did. And this isn't just any cultural site. These are for thermal features and campsites and some of those more sensitive areas or more high-value cultural sites. But since we haven't had the time to survey the entire property, nor probably the manpower to do so, we also have a pretty good idea of where cultural sites may be in these unsurveyed areas. And again, we use this information as we go about our day-to-day management, understanding where these resources may be. So with this information in hand, we really have developed and implemented some key sort of management practices. One is we survey prior to any disturbance. And our key management philosophy is really to avoid the sites. We've put a tremendous amount of time and effort into surveying the property and understanding where the cultural resources are or where they may be. And our first approach, anytime we build a trail or anytime we build a parking lot or anything that disturbs the surface, is to avoid a cultural site. Most of our trail construction occurred in 2006 and 7, 8, kind of in that time frame. We have very little new disturbance now, but we still utilize that philosophy as we rebuild trails or relocate trails for various reasons. We're an on-site only property. And one of the key decisions we made along the way is we couldn't protect the property if people could go anywhere they wanted to, because we knew where they would go, and we didn't want them there. And so we decided early on, and this was driven largely by concerns over cultural resource protection, of making this an on-trail only property, and we could then put the trails where we want to and avoid those sensitive areas where we had at-risk artifacts or at-risk natural resources as well. And so we've directed people away from those sort of clumped distributions of resources. We've directed people away from those locations as much as we can. That helps us protect the sites better. And then just from key messaging, I tend to talk about people and not artifacts. I mean, I think the interesting story is really about people's connection to this landscape, not about the artifacts they left behind. And that's just me as an ecologist. But I think that from a natural areas perspective, we are a natural resource-based organization, and to me that's key. The resource values that brought people to that landscape are the resource values we're continuing to protect today and conserve today, and I think that's an interesting story, and one that I think we don't always associate grasslands with having that human connection over long periods of time, and this is a property where it's pretty evident that that's happened. And then down to the archaeological sites themselves, is we've made a lot of changes in how the property's managed from grazing, from an erosional standpoint, things of that nature, really trying to stabilize some of these sites. We see a lot of soil movement. It's an erosive landscape. We're trying not to have accelerated rates of erosion, so we monitor that very closely. We change how we graze properties, and you'll see that at Lindenmeier when we go out, some things that we've done. But we have done that really to, again, with that philosophy of protecting the cultural resource in site or at the site it occurs. We really want to minimize the number of artifacts that are removed because of erosional or other management implications. And then we monitor the sites. We're very careful about monitoring really for two reasons. One, of course, the erosional aspect of what we're trying to manage, but also looking for evidence of other people being there. Soapstone's a wide open landscape. You know, we have gates that open and close, but gates that are easy to get around, and we always sort of watch these locations to see if people are finding their way there. Again, to date, we've had very little problems, and that's hopefully it's something that'll continue in the future. So the Lindenmeier site itself, one of the things that we do allow is we do allow access to the site. We do this with a permit, and that way we know who's there and why. When they're going to be there, and we can regulate that as best we can. So we do have groups that go there from time to time. It's not a lot, but we do allow that, and that's a great way to get people closer to the site that need to be there or want to be there. And the other part of our management approach that we started doing years ago, again working with Dr. LaBelle, is we try to collect at-risk artifacts or artifacts that have found their way to the surface for a variety of reasons. And the philosophy behind that is really get it before it disappears from the landscape, and then second, if somebody does get to the property and trespasses on and gets to these locations, we don't want them to find anything. We want them to sort of go away unhappy in this case. We want them to go away and think, geez, I went all that way in there and I couldn't find a thing. And that would be the best outcome for us. But it also allows us to at least get a glimpse of what's there from time to time as these artifacts sort of find their way to the surface and we get them picked up. And chances are, for those of us who go to the Lindenmeier site on Wednesday, I suspect there's going to be a few artifacts that could be laying about. And the other thing we've done is there was an old road that went by the site and some livestock issues. That, again, sort of an erosional standpoint. We tried to fix the erosion problems or the points of erosion. But we also wanted to, again, limit access. Lindenmeier site is kind of hard to get to. And again, for those of you who go Wednesday, we'll find that out. And so it's a tough walk in at times, and we wanted to make sure the easy access was taken off the table for folks. And the Lindenmeier Overlook, again, this was a site that we constantly heard through the public process that, you know, people wanted to see there, see the site. They wanted to get there. They wanted to learn about the site. It had been this locally famous archaeological site that nobody got to go to, and I think it was kind of frustrating for a lot of people. It had been closed for so long. And so we decided one of the best things we could do is provide access. It's visual access. You're within a quarter mile. It's easy to get to, but you get to look right into the site itself. And we have a lot of visitation, people that come to Soapstone just to go to this overlook and get a chance to take a glimpse at it. The other thing is that I find interesting is all of our public infrastructure was part of an art and public places project. And so our shelters and our displays were designed by Robert Tully, who's a local artist. And one of the things that that he looked at when he was looking at the artifacts that had been found on site was, from his artist mindset, that these were beautiful pieces of art that people living at the edge of the Ice Age were making. And that just amazed him that, I think his trailer pointed out, these folks weren't living sort of hand to mouth necessarily, or if they were, they still took time to make these beautiful pieces of artwork. And so he incorporated sort of his remaking of these pieces into the overlook. And we can use these as part of our interpretive efforts, and we can use these to really, again, talk about that, these artifacts are associated with people. People sat down and made these and put them to use in these landscapes that we don't always think about as being, nice, comfortable places to live. And we're doing so in a way that is pretty amazing. So that's kind of a summation of what we've done to date. It's how we manage the site, our protect in place, avoid impacts, but really, what are the next steps? And I think that's one of the more interesting questions that we have as we go through this next year or two. We've identified a need recently for a cultural resource policy. Right now, our cultural resources are sort of on a management plan basis. We sort of site by site try to think about how we want to manage cultural resources. Several of our properties have cultural sites on them, and we manage those separately from one another. We don't have a broad umbrella that we sort of make decisions under, and I think now is the time for us to do that. In fact, we just developed a master plan and completed that planning process. And really what a master plan is sets out the pace for the next 10 years of what Natural Areas is going to do. And so we need to develop this policy, and we need to think about what it's going to say. We also have some historic designation that we need to do at Soapstone. We have all these beautiful old buildings that we continue to use, and we need to protect those through a historic designation process. We also need to maintain and restore some of these buildings. We use them every day, and there's some maintenance needs that we're facing, and so that's an important next step for us as well. But really, what are the research opportunities that we need to begin thinking about? Right now, we're pretty hands-off. Again, protect in place. And it's now the time to expand, that role of Natural Areas and invite people in to visit these sites in a little different way. And again, not just the Lindenmeier site, but all these cultural sites that we have on our properties. And if we do that, how do we make decisions about what are the projects we support, what are the projects we don't support, and what are the important questions that we can help answer by providing some access? And I think that's kind of the key question moving forward. And that's going to be a difficult one, quite frankly, for Natural Areas and many members of our public to think about, because there's some safety in being able to say no all the time as we begin to have access to these sites, or if we begin to have access to these sites. It does raise the bar from a management standpoint of making our jobs more difficult, which is fine. We just need to sort of understand what all that means. And then finally, I guess I wanted to point out, Dr. LaBelle has been a tremendous value to the Natural Areas Department over the years, and he and I started in our roles about the same time in Fort Collins, which he saved my bacon many times, I think. But he needs to continue. He's been the guy that we've gone to, and I want him to continue to play that role. And really the same for the Fort Collins Museum, a great partner in sort of managing and understanding our cultural resources across our properties, and having them continue in that capacity. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if there are comments folks want to have in terms of what those next steps may be. I think this would be a great time to talk about them. The Bison Project? Yeah, absolutely. We, as part of our management plan, we've identified some species reintroductions, and we just kind of completed one, or started one, how you think about it. Oh, thank you. But one of which is bison, and we're working with Colorado State University and USDA, APHIS, on a bison project to bring, we used to say genetically pure, I'm not sure that's the correct term because it's so hard to define, but high levels of genetic integrity, bison to Soapstone. We're pretty close to being able to do that. We're working on some agreements between the parties, and the research that CSU has been doing is becoming successful. And hopefully, cross your fingers, next year, I don't know. Yeah, we'll probably start pretty small. And sort of the research side of this is the holy grail for bison are Yellowstone bison, but the political downside of that is just Brucella, bringing Brucella out of the park with bison. CSU is working on some reproductive technology that allows the reproductive materials to be brought out of Yellowstone, ova and semen, create an embryo, put it into a surrogate female, bring the genetics out of Yellowstone, but leave Brucella behind. And as crazy as that sounds, it kind of works. And so that's the project that they're working on. And so what we're doing at Soapstone is taking the philosophy of starting a conservation herd that we can use these genetically pretty unique animals to send out to other conservation herds as well. So we may only have less than 20 animals right now, but forever's a long time in managing these landscapes, and who knows what happens in the next 10 years. Maybe it grows. But it's really sort of a beginning of starting that bison conservation project. We've not to date. I mean, we've had a few folks wander up there. We've caught a few. I'm sure there's been plenty of folks up there we've not caught. Monitoring the sites, we're really not finding evidence of people being there. And so if our gates are functioning and closed and we're closed in the wintertime, that's a tough landscape to walk across in a big stiff north wind in January. So its climate alone helps us protect that site a little bit as well. Well, there's sort of two phases right now. We have kind of a phase one, which is, I think, about 700 acres, and a phase two that goes to about 2,000. And those are rough numbers. It really kind of depends on the finances we're able to put together to build some of the infrastructure. From there, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of the start. And those numbers are really based on kind of the herd size we sort of see having up there in the near future. But it may grow in time, and we'll have to see. One of the things the museum helped us with early on is meeting with some of the tribal elders from various tribes. And we took them to the site and really talked about conservation values to them of the property. And we had some great conversations. And part of that is what led us to sort of this hands-off approach, or this leave-it-in-place approach. They have a different view, obviously, of the cultural resources. There are people left behind, and who owns them or who doesn't own them. And it was fun and interesting conversations, but one that we need to continue to have, especially if we change sort of our philosophy as we move forward. You bet. And like you and many others, it is concerning, the proliferation of oil and gas exploration in the landscape around us. Soapstone, Meadow Springs, Red Mountain, like many western landscapes, is what's considered a severed estate. We own the surface, somebody else owns the minerals, and that's pretty common. Unfortunately, in our case, it's true. We don't own our minerals. We took approach really two different sort of major looks. One is we entered into a management sort of planning process called Energy by Design, and we worked with the Nature Conservancy and we worked with the state of Colorado to put together kind of a comprehensive look at the distribution of the resource values across the property, and identified areas that could not be impacted by oil and gas. We took them off the table in terms of no wells, no roads, things of that nature. We also had to identify areas that we could manage oil and gas with reasonable certainty. And so it's sort of a 30-second discussion of a very long process, but we tried to put together a comprehensive plan on how we would approach oil and gas exploration if it does come to our doorstep. The other approach we took is trying to better understand the potential for oil and gas development on the property. So we had, over the few years, 3 independent looks at the geology and the potential for oil and gas. And you're right, we're not in the epicenter, we're kind of on the western edge. And each report provided some promising news. We'll see how well it holds, but kind of the conclusion was it's not very likely to have economically recoverable, petroleum resources, because of some of the shale play that's going on right now actually comes to the surface at Soapstone, and so it's tilting sort of to the west. It's very thin and it's not very deep, and none of that sort of helps develop the petroleum that people are going after in the Wattenberg and to the resources to the east of us. So we're hopeful, but we don't know. I mean, time tells how all that plays out. We met with representatives from the Sioux tribe, the Ute, Mountain Ute, and Northern Cheyenne, I believe. And the relationship I'd like to continue. It was very, very helpful. We have about 10,000 to 12,000 visitors a year, primarily bicyclists. They're probably our biggest user group, certainly in the more extensive trail system. We have about 40 miles of trails on Soapstone. Not all new. Some are old roads we converted to trails. Some are new trails. The purpose-built trails, or the trails we built specifically to host recreational activities, are very stable. They're built to take the bicycling. They're built to take horseback riding and hiking, which are 3 recreational activities. Built to shed water. They're really well constructed. The problems that we have are areas that we've converted 2 tracks to trails. It's a big landscape, and we could only do so much at the time. And those have had some erosional issues, and so we're going back now and rerouting trails. We're building, again, sort of taking those segments offline, building purpose-built trails to able to control that erosional aspect. It's gone really well. We have our initial releases were 30 black-footed ferrets, kind of on Soapstone, and we put another 12 out last Wednesday on Meadow Springs. Our initial 30-day sort of post-release surveys we just concluded Thursday night, Friday morning, and we found about a third of the individuals that were released. And so we'll have another 30-day monitoring here mid-November that we'll go out and look again. So so far we're doing fine. Next September I think will really be the story, in terms of reproduction rates and mortality rates over that next year. Are we seeing successful recruitment, into that adult population from wild-born kits and things like that? So a little early to tell, but so far it's promising.
Are they collared?
They're not collared. It's hard to get a collar on them because of their body shape. They're like a hairy pipe with legs, and so it slips off. But they are pit tagged. And so what we do is we go out at night and spotlight them. And once we find the burrow they're occupying, we put a ring reader over it. And when they come up, it reads their pit tag. And so each one has a unique number to it. So that's how we keep track of them. Yeah. Meadow Springs is really an interesting property in that it's owned by the utility department, and that's where the biosolids go from the wastewater treatment plants. So when you hit the flusher, that's where it all ends up in time. And so there's some, because of the permitting process they go through and handling of biosolids, there's some limitations of public use. There are portions of the property they've talked to us about building trails into and opening up for public access. And so we're kind of continuing that conversation to see if that's doable. In terms of the natural resource and the cultural resource, we do help manage those values on their property. So they've been involved in, ferret reintroduction. They're involved in the bison discussions. They were involved in energy by design, and so they're really a pretty strong conservation partner. And they're a big, large property as well, 26,000 plus acres, right to our adjacent border to the east. So a great landscape. Again, very intact system that has a tremendous amount of value to it. We have. We had talks with them early on, and probably one will, as we're getting closer to bringing bison to Soapstone, we'll sort of renew those discussions as well. They kind of have their own thing going right now. They have a herd they're, for all good reasons, very proud of. They have a great management system in place. Bison are odd in that, unlike cattle, it's hard to introduce new animals into existing herds. There's this whole social structure that bison tend to have. And so they're concerned, and I certainly understand of bringing these animals in that would they be integrated into the herd in a way that would make sense. I think as we start a new herd on Soapstone, we have some great opportunities to continue to work with them on some parts of the project, and I think they'll eventually be a very active role, play an active role in what we do. I hope that's the case. Well, bison and buffalo are different. So buffalo tend to be, sort of the African, critter, old world sort of animal, and bison are unique to North America. So they are the same difference between pronghorn and antelope. They're commonly used to describe the same animal, but the pronghorn we have are not antelope. So they're different. bison and buffalo are different as well. Yeah, Soapstone is so far from town. I think it's kind of off the radar, and I think projects like this, discussions like this, symposium like this, really help get the word out about Soapstone. We've done a lot of sort of marketing, if you want to call it that, about the values of Soapstone, the recreational opportunities. But the other, I guess, reality of Soapstone is really two things. One is it's a landscape that not a lot of people are attracted to. I mean, it's hot and it's windy and it's dusty and it's cold, and it's a beautiful landscape, and I absolutely love it. But I'm not. I think other people would have a different opinion of that. And it's far enough from town. You're competing with other recreational opportunities that may be more appealing to a lot of people. Into the mountains type of recreation. So, but with that said, I think you're absolutely right. I think we continue to do things to try and promote people going to Soapstone and finding ways to recreate there. I think you're absolutely right. It's a tremendous place to see wildlife. Yeah, and we do. We sure try to promote those resource values that you've talked about. In fact, we have several programs for education and outreach that Zoe puts on that take people to Soapstone sort of off trail, behind the scenes, to look at just those resources. It's a dark sky area. We have a night sky monitoring, and we have folks who go up there at night to stargaze. We have wildlife viewing opportunities, sort of homestead tours, and we do a lot of that. And obviously we need to get better at promoting those resource values because they are tremendous. And ferrets were, quite frankly, a great way to talk about the grassland systems and prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, and sort of the intact grasslands that we have. So we were able to really build a pretty nice story around that reintroduction effort. Bison will follow that same suit. Yeah, the road going up has been a challenge to keep smooth. And we're responsible for maintenance of that road, and we do blade it from time to time. It's rough, and for those who go up on Wednesday, we'll get a first-hand sort of feel for how bumpy that can be. So tighten all the bolts up on your car before you take off. Yeah, that's a great thought. I think in time we will get better at those things. A lot of these events that we put on are new to us as well, and they're great fun to attend. They really are, and I think we'll learn to take advantage of those opportunities to get it on film, to put it out for more people to see. Whether it's the same experience as being there in person, probably not, but it is a great way to sort of advertise Soapstone and some of the opportunities it presents in terms of getting outside and doing some different things. And we're also embracing sort of new stories to tell about Soapstone, sort of meeting with ranchers and doing things like that, of sort of bringing other parts of the history in place. So I think we're trying to get better as well at bringing those new programs to light. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I think in many ways we're kind of unique. Not many communities, support acquisition of a property like that, like Soapstone, like Meadow Springs, and counties like Red Mountain. So in terms of a National Historic Landmark or properties with this type of sort of resource value, probably few and far between if there are. Certainly, when we went through the ferret reintroduction process, I mean, we're definitely the only municipality that's ever done that. So there are some firsts up there for a municipally owned open space property. That's a great question. Yeah, we have. We've met several times with the city of Cheyenne and their planning department. They own and manage the Belvoir Ranch, which is north of Soapstone, about another 20,000 acres. They purchased it for a variety of sort of utility purposes and municipal purposes, one of which is open space. The property that they own, sort of separate from the Belvoir, is called the Big Hole Open Space, and it's in the Wyoming side, and there is trail access from the south. The difficulty of getting trail access from the north has been getting across the railroad tracks, or getting under the railroad tracks, or getting some sort of access through the right-of-way the railroad holds on that property. They can be kind of tough to deal with. And so getting public access has been challenging. They've worked on it, and they are still trying to do so. But that's been sort of the limiting factor right now. I think once that's resolved, there could be some trail development, one, on the Belvoir itself, and then two, some access from the north into at least the northwest corner of Soapstone to the north end of Red Mountain. Yeah, we've not done that. We share that road with Duck Creek Grazing Association, and then it's our ranch access as well. We did look at that initially as sort of an access point onto the property and chose not to pursue that. We wanted to sort of really bring our access in one location from the south. So Duck Creek had some concerns about that as well. We'd also shared by some ranching families that are in Wyoming just to the north of Soapstone as well. So it's sort of a multiple use road that it's not just ours to make that decision with. Yeah, I agree. I think it is a better term to describe the properties we manage. There are properties we do kind of consider open space. We do conserve, for example, irrigated farmland between Fort Collins and Wellington. They're not owned by natural areas. We hold conservation easements on them and things of that nature. We consider those open space. Yeah, I agree. There's public access is sort of a double-edged sword, and as resource managers, the fewer the people that are easy, my job's much easier. But it is a tremendously valuable place for people to be and learn about natural and cultural history. We do have an extensive program through our education department for grade school, sort of exposure to natural resources. Tremendous amount of volunteer time is sort of spent in that area through our Master Naturalist programs. One of the issues we've ran into with Soapstone and probably Red Mountain is it's so far from town, schools can't afford to send buses up there, and it's an all-day trip. And so it's proven to be very difficult to get those school groups to Soapstone because of that. Yeah, they do Eco Week, and it'd be great to have them do those sorts of activities at Soapstone. I think it's going to take time and just sort of chipping away at the old norms. They always go to the same place. Maybe a new place like Soapstone is something we can build into that curriculum in time. So I think those are all challenges that lie ahead for us. I absolutely agree. I think there's some tremendous opportunities there if we can chip away at that question. Thank you so much for your time. Great questions. I appreciate the interest.